Hello, this is Alex Burns here from Quintessence Theater, and we have a very special guest with us today, joining us from England, Hailey Bachrach. Hailey, I met Hailey when we were beginning to devise a different history play project, and Hailey was introduced to me by Will Tosh, who is the director of education at the Globe Theater. I think he's still there still. And my focus or my question for Will was looking at queerness or the idea of queerness in Shakespeare's plays, specifically his history plays. So that's something we're very much exploring with Rare Accidents. And I'm really honored to have Hailey here just to talk about all of that. So, Hailey, would you just start by sharing a little bit about yourself and your journey with Shakespeare?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for chatting with me and also for like reaching out all that time ago. It's always been so like interesting and fun to get to talk to you. Yeah, so gosh, where did I begin with Shakespeare? So I, like many people, began my theater aspirations as an actor when I was, in school and in college. And I just always found doing Shakespeare the most fun from a performance perspective. It was a thing that I just like felt like I understood the best and like just liked doing. I liked the challenge of it. And then as I was moving away from acting, I just continued to love Shakespeare, continued to love reading the plays. I just found them so like rich and interesting. And one of the like real turning points for me to lead me on the path to eventually kind of doing a PhD and like becoming a sort of Shakespeare scholar actually was a performance of one of the history plays at the Globe, bringing it all together. It was a production of Henry IV, Part One, and then Part Two, two separate shows with Roger Allam as Falstaff. And Jamie Parker as Prince Hal. And it was an incredible production. I had never really encountered the history plays before, and certainly had never encountered them in a way. I think I fell asleep in a production of Richard III once when I was like in high school, but I had never encountered them in a way that made me realize they were like these really human dramas. And I just remember being shocked by how contemporary all of the emotions and the relationships felt, and like how just completely engaged I was over the course of like, 2 3 hour long plays in a single day, standing, the whole time. It really just it completely blew my mind. And I remember I went like literally that, probably not that day, but like that week, and like bought like an anthology of all the history plays and just read them all. And some of them I had to read a couple times to like understand what was going on, because some of them do have kind of dense language or like all these reference to like English history that I didn't know. But it was like I was just so compelled. I didn't mind. I was like, yeah, I'll read it again. I'll read it again right now. And that was really the thing that just like unlocked something for me. And as I continued studying and continued working in theater, I just found myself going back to the history plays every time. Even when I'd try to do a project about something else, it would turn into being about the history plays. So, um, yeah, they're just at like the heart of kind of what pulled me into studying and loving Shakespeare.
That's amazing. I think I similarly had met each of the plays over the course of my lifetime as individual works. And I think it really wasn't until I was working on my first production of Richard III, where then I was going back to the Henry Sixes and going like, oh my God, if you don't know these stories and these characters, how do you even enjoy or engage with Richard III? And then shortly after that project, Michael Boyd did his famous history cycle at the RSC, where he did the both Henriads together with the same cast. And I was fortunate enough to be there for that week where they did it all together for the first time. And going on that journey of the entire history cycle was just true, still remains one of the greatest weeks of my entire life. And I hope to someday be able to create something similar. But for now, we're working on the Henry IV plays. Um,
Which, great ones. Maybe when people, inevitably, when I say what I do, people ask me what my favorite Shakespeare play is, and I usually default to Henry IV, Part One.
yeah, an awesome one. I also did get to see that production you referenced at the Globe, and that yeah, that was truly just absolutely mind blowing. The synergy of those actors with those characters and the whole event in the Globe was so very special.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, the night that I saw it, they had like this gag where they were like throwing a boiled egg at each other and they accidentally threw it and it hit an audience member in the face. And they just like started laughing. And so that was it was like the second scene. So that was like a great start to the experience as well.
Truly. Um, so the thing sort of, I don't want to jump ahead of ourselves, but something that I'm so excited to talk about is this idea of queerness in Shakespeare. And I was wondering, that's one of your focuses as well as the history plays. Could you just share with me a little bit before we talk specifically about the Henry Fours, what kind of made that one of your focuses?
Yeah, I mean, I think uh I don't really have a good answer for it. You know, I'm queer myself, and so it just is like the way I think about things sort of inevitably. Um and I think a lot of it as well came from like a lot of my early Shakespeare experiences were in single gender companies. I was in an all women's Shakespeare company when I was in college, and it we weren't doing a lot of kind of explicitly queer stuff per se. I mean, it was Sarah Lawrence, so we obviously were on some level, but not the way that people probably are now or that I would now. But it was, it highlighted for me in my like earliest experiences of Shakespeare the way that like the gender dynamics of these plays are just really like rich and interesting and weird, and the um yeah, um it's always just kind of like been an element for me that like has really jumped out to me and been really noticeable. And I actually think that the history plays are like a really crucial part of it for me because I think as we know from pop culture and things like Top Gun, the more like masculine something is, like the like correspondingly queerer it tends to feel. And the history plays are such like boy plays with lots of men. And so, there's just so many kind of weird erotic dynamics. And also Shakespeare loves the kind of conflation of like eroticism and violence. And these are plays that are all about war. So you've got men kind of, penetrating each other with swords. So I just think that like my fascination with them was like actually like a really crucial part of like why that became a lens that I like enjoy reading the plays through.
Yeah, very much so. I think when we were talking about the Henry VI plays, we kind of tapped on this idea. But something that I've been really fascinated by, and you could probably speak to this better than I can, but for those people that are not like madly obsessed with these history plays, Shakespeare wrote these two sort of cycles, these Henriads, each a tetralogy, four plays each. And the first one that he wrote was actually the end of the story, the Henry Sixes into Richard III. And then the second one he wrote was Richard II all the way through to Henry V. And then there's one or two other plays that sort of fit into that larger cycle. And what I've been so fascinated in on working specifically on the Henry Fours is if you look at that whole cycle and you look at the role of gender, specifically the idea of the warrior male or the sort of uber powerful masculine force versus the more effeminate or poetic or the word skipping or flamboyant male king exists that becomes more the effeminate or the boyish king. And looking at the whole course of the history cycle, if you start with what was Christopher Marlowe's play Edward II, where we have one of the sort of noted queer characters. He has a male partner lover that sort of sets off a lot of the drama in that play. And then we flip back and forth through the Edward III, the sort of grand patriarch that we hear about constantly in these plays, and then all of his sons. The first one being Edward I, the great, the one of the warrior princes of English history. I'm so fascinated in the way that the kings literally sort of go shifting back and forth between what is identified almost as a queer or effeminate or boyish king, and then the counterforce, which is this warrior, invader, boisterous handed leadership style king. And that it actually does go Edward II, Edward III, Richard II, Bolingbroke turns into Henry IV. And then he has this son, Prince Hal, who is, he calls him effeminate. He says errant. He says he calls him degenerate. all of these words, which even today are coded as being queer and sort of derogatory terms for queerness. Um, and then suddenly, through the course of this play, the Henry Ford plays, we watch this sort of exuberance of Hal transformed into what becomes ultimately the warrior of Henry V, and that transformation. And I'm so in trying to take these two massive plays. Henry Ford Part One is definitely one of my favorites, and then some of the scenes in Henry Ford Part Two are definitely some of my favorites. And trying to slam it all together, I've had so much fun looking at that kind of idea, and I'm curious, like how that sits with you in your own sort of exploration of these plays.
There's a scholar whose name I can't remember now. I'll look it up and I'll send it to you and we can like post it somewhere because I want to give them credit for this idea who
Yeah,
talks about exactly that cycle. And as I recall, kind of frames it as this kind of almost working through the problem of Queen Elizabeth. Because Elizabeth was the queen at the time that Shakespeare was writing this set of plays, but she was quite old. And so there was a lot of anxiety around what's coming next. You know, she never married, famously. She refused to name her heir until basically right before she died for a range of pretty sensible political reasons, but it lent obviously an air of anxiety and instability because like we just have no clue who's coming next, which is not very usual in a monarchy. The whole idea is like the heir is right there. Um, and so it was this idea that by cycling through these kind of like regenerations of a kind of quote unquote effeminate ruler, and this scholar points out that even like Henry IV himself almost goes through this cycle in himself. He begins like as like the virile kind of usurper and then becomes ill and becomes old and becomes weak, but then is kind of, the line is revived by, Hal conquering France, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, it was this idea that like it's a sort of working through of this anxiety about their own monarch and their own kind of weird leadership situation and their own the culture's kind of uncertainty about what that meant and what was next, and this desire to kind of like reassure themselves in a way that like everything's going to be fine, someone good's coming, but also the kind of awareness of the sort of morality and fragility of like any monarch. Um, so I think that's definitely something that other people see in it too, and I think it's a really interesting way of like, especially when you're doing the task that you're doing of trying to kind of like create a narrative out of but really two different narratives, or really a play and then a sequel, which doesn't, you know, has its own very, very weird narrative structure. I think that's a really brilliant, like, and fascinating, like, organizing principle. I think the element of it that I, find really interesting and always find myself talking about when I'm having these conversations is, what is when do we need to be careful about assuming that certain kind of codes of masculinity then are the same as they were for us? And obviously, there's a degree to which, as like, a theater maker, an audience is going to hear effeminate and degenerate and leap to conclusions that we have no control over. I, as a scholar, can come in and give as many footnotes as I want, and people are going to hear what they hear. And that is powerful too. And like, a valid reading in itself. But the character who really gets talked about as feminine in Henry IV Part One is Hotspur, who is the foil to Prince Hal. He is like the perfect knight, the ideal, English warrior. The beginning of the play, he's like conquered the Scots, and he's everybody's ideal. Everyone thinks he's perfect. But then he opens his mouth and he can't keep his temper. He babbles. He's storming out of rooms and throwing temper tantrums, and everyone in his family are constantly calling him womanly, womanish, feminine, because for the kind of people of Shakespeare's time, to be that intemperate in your emotions was feminine. So it doesn't matter that he's being masculine and violent. He's uncontrolled. And that is actually like the feminine thing about him.
hmm.
And similarly for Hal, it's not, again, we have these words that have a weight that I think you could definitely put in a production, but really the thing they're referring to when they call him effeminate is he's out drinking all the time. He's partying with the lads, which to us is like, yeah, he's just being a man. But no, that's actually the kind of feminine problem, is this lack of restraint and like self-control, which isn't to like contradict what you say at all. But I think it's really interesting how within this cycle, the kind of cues are not always exactly what they would be in like our own time.
Yeah, very much so. Tell me, for someone that doesn't is not familiar with this story, what would you say to them to prepare them to come see your favorite play?
It is my favorite. Ooh, okay. I think the first thing I'd say is the thing I always say, which is that don't panic. You're going to hear a lot of names, but they don't matter. I recently did an introduction to the new Oxford edition of Richard II. There's my little plug. And I was really adamant that I did not want a family tree in it. Because the argument that I was trying to make was like the emotional relationships will become clear. You don't need to know the details of who these people are or how they relate to each other, because in these plays, like frankly, unlike many of the more kind of popular and famous plays, the nature of the characters' connections is just made so clear in the scenes. You understand, like these two people, there's some kind of uncle and nephew, father and son, not quite sure, but clearly there's a sort of like older relative and younger relative dynamic happening here. Or like those two guys clearly used to be on the same side, and I can tell they are not anymore. And that's all you need to know. And I think that's the thing that is so, I think so many people scare themselves away from the history plays before they even begin because they're like, I gotta study it. It's like, just pay attention to the way the characters feel about each other and talk to each other. And that's like genuinely, truly all of the information that you need.
Yeah, definitely. And what would you say for you if you're looking through in your mind the Henry IV Part One play? Is there something that sort of sits as the pinnacle or the sort of achievement of it that it unlocks for you personally?
I think it's a couple things. I think there's a fun thing and like a really dorky thing. To me, the really dorky thing is it has this absolutely perfect parallel structure. So you have these two kind of rivals, Prince Hal, who's the actual heir, but he's a screw up, and then you have Hotspur, the perfect knight, a little hot tempered, but he, becomes a rebel. And so you have those two are in tension, and quite early on, we are set up with the expectation that like they're gonna fight each other, obviously. Um, and from that point, the play perfectly parallels them just along the entire play. It's like this beautiful, like A plot, B plot, A plot, B plot, like pattern throughout. And just as like a literary person, I just find that like really pleasing and delightful. And then of course culminating in them finally like facing each other. Um, and but I think that like the other part of it and the thing that's my other sort of pitch to people who are maybe wary about seeing history plays, the thing that I experienced when I watched it, which is that the characters are so just feel to a modern viewer so psychologically real in a way that like I just think many Shakespeare characters don't always, sometimes even the most famous characters can feel a little flat or a little tropey, or like the production's having to do a lot of work to kind of make them feel like people. But I think Prince Hal has this buddy called Falstaff, who's the kind of clown character, but that is understating it. If you're thinking of other Shakespeare clowns, you're not thinking of the right thing, because he is just one of the most fully formed comic characters, like in all of Shakespeare. He is a person. Like he is so real. And similarly, there's this moment early on when Prince Hal has a soliloquy, and you're just I every time I hear it, I'm just like, this is so modern. This is so like this is just such a recognizable circumstance. Like the language isn't that dense. Like everything about it just feels like it just pins you in place with how much it feels like something so real and not kind of as distancing as like a Shakespeare kind of soliloquy sometimes feels. And that is just the thing I can never ever get over about this play. I just feel like every character in it to me feels like some of the most fully realized like human people that Shakespeare ever depicted.
Definitely. Yeah. I feel the same way, especially some of Hal's stuff. I mean, his psychology, to think of this as being written before sort of the advent of 20th century psychology, his sense of his own ego, his sense of his seeming versus his being, and the strategies involved in like a public presentation of self feels so much of this current moment in terms of, as we're debating, what does it mean to be a public person versus a private person?
Yeah. I'm always, really hesitant to kind of ascribe deep kind of Freudian psychology to Shakespeare characters for a range of reasons, but with Hal, like you just can't not. There's no other explanation for like the things the character does and the way that he responds to events. And, I think again, it's like if you've seen characters like Othello, characters like Iago and Richard III, who kind of turn to the audience and are like, I'm about to do something pretty naughty. And Hal's version of that is just so much more nuanced and like self-deluded, but also true. It's just like, it's genuinely difficult to convey until you just have to see it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you said I'm working with Tyler Bay is playing Hal for us, and we've been working very intensely on a lot of those moments. And the self delusion of Hal is really fascinating. He thinks he's in control. He thinks he knows what he's doing and what he wants, and then the play keeps like knocking him backwards or thrusting him forwards in ways that he doesn't anticipate. And I think that also just adds to this sort of human quality to it, as opposed to your normal sort of arc of character. He really does go on such a human journey from the start of this story to the end.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I hadn't quite thought of it that way, but I think that's so right. Like compared to um other Shakespeare plays where a character sets out an intent, and in a comedy, they're going to fail at this intent in a funny way, and in a tragedy, they're going to fail at this intent in a completely horrible way, or they'll get it and it'll be bad. And there's like in most plays, I feel like the sense of reversal comes from like I don't know quite how to describe it, but like often like something external, like like Romeo and Juliet. It's like, oh no, like yeah, it's kind of because Romeo lost his temper and it wasn't nice to Tybalt, but also like it was a lot of chaotic external circumstances that kind of, caused this tragedy to happen. Or even something like Hamlet, it's like, yes, it's because of things Hamlet did, but it's also because I don't know, just bad luck, the sense of the world just turning against him because this is a tragedy. But when Prince Hal has what I sort of see as like his turning point, where like for the first time he's, expressed this intention of like, I'm going to pretend to suck, if I could use that word. And then people are going to be so impressed when I turn around and actually I'm great. And then he's having this conversation with his father where it becomes really clear that like his father does not believe at all that this is only an act. His dad is like, you do suck a lot. I wish that other guy was my son. And he has to, make this really dramatic vow of like, no, I'm going to prove myself. I swear. And it's this moment that, again, it's like the only kind of reversal that's happened is like your bluff didn't work. Like your grand plan already fell apart. So like, what now? And it just feels, yeah, I think that's such a great point. It just doesn't feel anything like the structure of like other Shakespeare kind of heroes' journeys.
Yeah. I just want to talk about Falstaff one more time for a little bit longer because he is such a larger than life character. I did, we've all read a million essays about Shakespeare and how it was written and these plays were developed. And I remember reading one that suggested the possibility that at one point it actually was the sort of arc of the two plays as one, but that, Falstaff was such a powerful character that Shakespeare felt the need to kind of break the Henry IV story apart and sort of elaborate all of the antics of Falstaff and some of the other subplots. I'm just curious if you've ever crossed that sort of theory, or if you have any thoughts about that.
I was literally just listening to a BBC radio like show about Henry IV Part One, and they mentioned this theory, which I'd never heard before.
Okay.
And I think it makes sense. I think the way that they put it, I think it was Lucy Monroe who said it. Yeah, it was the idea that like it seems like probably Shakespeare was setting up for Henry IV and then Henry V to be a two-parter because that was super common at the time to have two-part plays, and you really, really rarely see anything more than two parts. But then, yeah, the character Falstaff was just so popular. He kind of forced a kind of continuation of just because Henry IV Part Two is super Falstaff centric. So yeah, it feels a little like yeah, spin-off sequel about that beloved comic secondary character from the first one, except for then you have the Merry Wives of Windsor, which actually is that, and he breaks Falstaff off even more and like sends him to basically like contemporary for them, like Windsor, and it's got nothing to do with the history plays at all. So yeah, I think there's quite a lot of evidence in the form of like just the continued use of the character that Falstaff was really popular and was probably driving a lot of sort of attention to the plays. So I think it makes perfect sense to me that he sort of inserted another play in there before Henry V because he wanted to get more Falstaff time.
Yeah. It feels very much like the current Marvel films where it's like this character really develops audience attention and loyalty, and then they suddenly have a whole spin-off series.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I think the other part that is so exciting for me is, we've acknowledged that these history plays are sometimes very overwhelming to audiences, specifically audiences that don't have a relationship to the history. And I'm so grateful for what you said, that if you just kind of let it wash over you and you experience the human drama, that's where the thrill of it is. I think the other part for me about the history plays is stylistically, they do seemingly not follow the rules of, as you were saying, the tragedies or the comedies, but allow for both sort of rules of theater of genre to exist. And I'm curious if you could share a little bit of your thoughts on that reality, specifically
Yeah,
with
I'm
these two zany plays.
right. Yeah, because they're so funny, and then end so tragically. And I think that's part of why they feel really contemporary to us, is they break out of what feels like kind of formulaic genre tropes when it comes to like tragedy and comedy and even like tragicomedy. Um, and I do believe that the history play is its own genre. Not everyone does. Some people, in the original kind of printings, they were mostly billed as tragedies. And some of them look more like that than others. Obviously, Richard III is a pretty classic tragedy in its like shape and structure. Whereas Henry V is like nothing Shakespeare ever did before, a sense, and is completely weird. But the thing that I have written about when it comes to the sort of genre of the history plays, I think they are so indelibly marked by being um, stories without an ending. Obviously, the thing that defines a comedy or a tragedy is the way that it ends. It either ends in like a marriage and renewal, or it ends in death and sort of a renewal, but the renewal is going to happen later. And history plays, I feel, or Shakespeare's history plays, are constantly aware that however we end, something else is going to happen and did happen. And conceptually, the audience could go find out what that thing was. And something happened before this. And, there's a million things happening alongside this. And I think it's that sort of presence of a timeline kind of that like stretches them into these weird shapes, because I think Shakespeare to me feels really aware that like it's impossible to draw the sort of narrative conclusions that you draw in other genres. You can kind of, mimic them. Like when a character dies at the end, it feels tragic, but you still have this guy standing in the background who's going to become king. And like, maybe he's got a, if he's Henry Tudor, everyone knows what's going to happen there. So you can't ever like close it off the way that you can with other genres. And I think that sort of seeps into all of the storytelling sort of in ways that are almost difficult to always like be aware of. But to me, that's like, that feels like the kind of engine of why they feel so kind of defiant of any clear other genre.
Yeah, which is one of the many reasons I do absolutely adore these plays. Just to
Yeah.
have, there's so many times, especially in the Henry IV Part Twos, where you actively have three clowns on stage, all competing for the audience's love, and it's such a gift. I feel like
Yeah.
playwrights today don't take those risks of kind of breaking genres, or, creating a competition of focus or energy on stage in a scene inherently. And so it's
That was genuinely the thing that like got me about that production of Henry IV, specifically part two, when we got to that part of the day at the Globe back in the day. And it was, like I said, a sort of like two, both plays in one, so most of the audience is there for like 7 hours. And it was a really rowdy audience as well, as you sometimes get at the Globe. Like people were shouting things and like cheering, and like it was just, just the full energy. And then am I allowed to spoil things? Is that
yeah, yeah, go for it.
great? So at the end, there's this moment where Hal's father has died. He's been crowned King Henry V, and Falstaff tries to come to his coronation, and Hal rejects him, stops in the street. I know you not, old man. And the room was silent. like I can't express the completeness of the silence of the theater as this was happening. And that a play had the power to go from people like going ooh and like sex worker characters like flicking her skirts around to that silence and the sense that like oh, the play is so complicated, but clearly everybody understood exactly what was happening and was affected by it. That was just when I was like, these plays are something else. Like this is so powerful.
Yes, yes, immensely so. We're still only in our first couple previews, but we've gotten the audience to kind of gasp at that moment
Yeah.
also. So hopefully we're
Heck
going to
yeah.
just keep doing it.
Yeah,
Um,
I believe in you. I mean, it's
yeah.
not to take away anyone's, the productions obviously have a lot to do with it, but it's also like the play does it.
Oh, it's so,
If
yeah,
you give yourself to what the text is doing, it takes you there.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
I guess last thought before we wrap this up, because this has been so wonderful, and because you just introduced it kind of on the side, is this world of Eastcheap and what it means. Could you just talk a little bit about what Eastcheap was, and what it kind of in your mind might represents in the larger world of the play?
Yeah, I think there's kind of almost two answers to that question because one of the things that I love about all history plays from this time period is like history. The concept of historical accuracy was not prized, let us say. There were other things that were more important than like getting details, and certainly like the verisimilitude of a time and place, as we know from other Shakespeare plays, is like bottom of the priority list. And so Eastcheap, which is the kind of area of London where Prince Hal goes and drinks with Falstaff and hangs out with his buddies. It's right across the bridge from where the Globe was, right on the other side, like on the north side of the river. Like if you ever kind of walk across now today, like if you leave the Globe and walk across the bridge, London Bridge, like Eastcheap is right there. You can see Cheapside still, which I always am really delighted by. But so it's this kind of like really urban kind of social space basically where he spends his time, and it is completely like Shakespeare's London. It's not a sort of any gesture towards a medieval time period. Like they're referencing things that like existed in the time of the audience that was, watching it. And again, this audience gets to walk across the bridge and like be in that neighborhood. So they know like all these things they're talking about. So it's this brilliant kind of tool of separating the court, which is again, like we're not going for verisimilitude here, but it's, the lords, the kings, the people who are kind of above us, and then putting us, the audience, in this place that we know we also live there. It's this incredible tool to me for creating this sense of like comradeship and companionship and kind of identification with like why someone would want to be spending time in this place instead of in that horrible, stuffy, boring like court place. Um, and I think that it is another one of the things that feels so like contemporary and psychologically rich about the play is that like I think that Shakespeare is almost always asking, is being a king worth it? And in this play, he puts forward such a like vivid, compelling, fun counter argument. It's like, well, yeah, is being a king worth leaving behind this really fun place where everyone's funny? And we have these long scenes. There's like this incredibly long scene. I think it might be one of the longest scenes in Shakespeare, and where they're just hanging out in the pub all night. And like, it then creates, it adds so much richness and depth to this question of like, of course we think it's good that we think it's bad that a prince is doing these things, and we think it's good that you're going to give it up and become this iconically great king, but oh, like kind of at what cost? It just adds so much complication to the question that has like a clear intellectual answer, but he creates a really difficult emotional answer.
Yeah, and for Shakespeare's audience, how would a Mistress Quickly or Doll Tearsheet be perceived as the hostess of the tavern, or the whore of Eastcheap? Would they be welcomed into society? Like, where would they? Is it like today where it's looked down upon, but ultimately it's kind of
Mhm.
part of the
Yeah, I mean,
economy?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, so I think that like obviously they are both like kind of comic trope characters. So we see
Hmm.
characters a lot like them in tons of plays. And the degree to which any like trope is or is treated the same way as their like real life counterpart is like, you know, questionable. Sometimes we
Yeah.
like watching things on stage, but when we encounter them in real life, we're like, no, thank you. Um, the South Bank where the Globe was, and where we think the Globe was probably where these were performed. Well, that's a tricky question, actually. They were probably performed at their old theater, the theater up in the north, and Henry V was probably one of the first plays performed in the Globe. But either of those are, especially though the South, it's like basically they were in a complicated legal position where because they sort of were under a different jurisdiction than the rest of the city of London, there was a lot of sex work and you know, things that were illegal in other parts of the city you could go south of the river to do. And so, you know, by having a sex worker character and the implication of others, the implication that, you know, Mistress Quickly is kind of accused of keeping a bawdy house and like in part one, she insists she doesn't, and that seems true. But then by part two, that does not seem to be true anymore. Um, by Henry V, it's like explicitly not true anymore. And, you know, is another way of, I think, you know, it's evoking some of the local color. Like there are sex workers down the street, probably in the
Mhm.
audience. Like, you know, it's part of definitely part of the kind of like economy of that that neighborhood and that area in particular.
Yeah.
And you know, kind of then as now, like it's not legal. People have a range of religious objections to the idea of it, but you can also tell from like the way that it is joked about and talked about that like it's not, it's happening. Everyone knows it's happening. Um, so it's a yeah, like a one of those like really interesting and nuanced areas that's like definitely not my area of expertise, but like I think one of the places where you just the ways that culture contradicts itself that I think when you're looking back from the perspective of history it can be hard to kind of we understand it in our own lives, but we kind of assume everything was more black and white for people back then in some ways. Um, and then just really quickly, because this I do like is so important to me, is, you know, obviously Host is quickly a bit of a comic character, a very comic character, not so bright. And but the concept of female landlords, female pub owners, female theater owners was way more prevalent than we have kind of come down with in popular culture. Actually, in this whole thing where Shakespeare ended up, you know, was in that one theater and then there was a big dispute about the land and then they moved down to the Globe, like that was their kind of opposing sort of co-owner of the land was a woman because her husband had died and she inherited his property. Yeah, there's I mentioned it already, but like Lucy Monroe and Claire McManus are two scholars who do really amazing work about the kind of business women of London of this period and all of the various ways that even though women weren't on the stage, actually the kind of economy that underpinned a lot of the theaters, you know, people who were in charge of the food, people who owned the places the actors lived, people who owned land, owned pawn shops were often women. So I think that she, as like a woman who owns a pub, would not actually be very strange at all.
Mm. Yeah. Amazing. Well, Haley, thank you so much. You've given me a
Yeah,
lot to think about as we wrap up our rehearsal process and preview process, but so great to just have your insights into this extraordinary piece of theater.
yeah. Thank you. It's my absolute pleasure. I can't wait to hear how the production goes.
And hopefully we can continue to work together as we can bring Shakespeare to today.
Yeah.
Thank you again.